70 years in this world. Not a single person had ever made me feel as small as my own son did on a Friday night in Manhattan. Not the first boss who ever yelled in my face and told me I'd never amount to anything. Not the bank that rejected my first loan 3 times. Not even Sandra, my ex-wife, who left me for her cycling coach. Not the cardiologist who warned me at 52 that my heart needed to slow down. And not the partner who stole my client list back in 1987 and casually shook my hand on his way out the door. No one. Not once. Not anyone in 70 years until Jordan came along. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a snack and get comfortable. And remember, the people in these stories had every chance to do the right thing. They just chose wrong. Leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe. You're going to like it here. The gala was his idea. Of course it was. Jordan Price. My son. My own flesh and blood. The greatest achievement of my life and somehow the most baffling disappointment. He organized a charity fundraiser at the Meridian, one of those impossibly luxurious venues on Park Avenue. The kind of place where the chandeliers cost more than most cars. Where the waitstaff look at you like they graduated from a university, far more prestigious than you ever could. $600 a plate. 200 guests. Black tie only. 3 weeks ago he called me. His voice was full of that familiar excitement he only seems to have when something benefits him. "Dad, you have to come. It's going to be great. I need the family there." I should have known better. Jordan doesn't need family. He needs an audience. I was standing at table 14. Near the entrance. Near the kitchen. The kind of spot where the heat and the smell of searing steak hit your back every time the door swings open. I wore my lucky navy suit. The one I wore when I signed my first big contract. The same suit I wore when I took Jordan to his college graduation. It was a little tight around the waist now, and the fabric had started to thin at the elbows. But it was clean. I had pressed it myself that morning in my kitchen in Queens. I watched my son on stage. He looked radiant under the lights, laughing and chatting with tanned men and women dripping in diamonds. He belonged here, or at least he believed he did. I remembered the night sitting in a hospital at 2 in the morning while he burned with fever. The rainy mornings driving him to school. The lunches I packed with my own hands. The dollars I scraped together so he would never feel less than his friends. Everything I did was for him. And tonight, when he glanced toward table 14, his eyes slid right past me, like I was just another piece of old furniture waiting to be cleared away. Jordan picked up the microphone. The entire room fell silent. I took a slow breath. I had no idea that in just a few minutes my own son would use that microphone to auction off his father's dignity in front of hundreds of strangers. Starting at $1. Applause burst through the room as Jordan stepped up to the podium. He stood there confident, proud. The suit he wore cost more than 6 months of my retirement income. He adjusted the microphone, a smile spreading across his face. But it wasn't a smile meant for family. It was the smile of a hunter who had just spotted his prey. "Welcome to the most entertaining part of the evening," Jordan announced, his voice echoing across the elegant ballroom. "We all know we're here for charity, but I thought we could add a little personal flavor." The crowd began murmuring with curiosity. Jordan looked straight toward table 14, where I sat among half-finished plates and the smell of kitchen smoke drifting out from the door behind me. "Dad, come up here for a moment." He waved at me, an artificial gesture. I felt my chest tighten. I didn't want to go up there, but hundreds of eyes were already turning toward me. I stood, straightened the collar of my old suit, and walked toward the stage with heavy steps. "Let me introduce you all," Jordan said. "This is Eugene Price, my father." He placed a hand on my shoulder. The touch felt cold as ice. "He's a good man, but honestly, he's probably the most boring man you'll ever meet." Soft laughter began rippling through the tables below. Jordan didn't stop. He was intoxicated by the spotlight. He goes to bed at 9 o'clock. He still carries the same leather briefcase from the 1980s. And he can talk about saving money on parking fees for a full hour. The room erupted in laughter. Elegant women covered their mouths as they giggled. Men in tuxedos shook their heads in amusement. I stood there like a stone statue in the middle of a storm. The faces in the crowd blurred beneath the harsh stage lights. I remembered a winter night in 1994, when Jordan had a fever so high he was delirious. I stayed up all night cooling his forehead with damp cloths, praying that I could take the pain instead of him. I remembered working overtime until I was exhausted, just so I could buy him the basketball shoes he had dreamed of. All those sacrifices. All that love. And now it had been reduced to a punchline on a stage on Park Avenue. So Jordan declared loudly, "We're going to auction off an evening with my boring father. The winner will get to hear all about checking tire pressure and the secret to shopping for clearance deals. We'll start the bidding at $1, because honestly that's already generous." $1. The words pierced straight through me. It hurt more than any physical wound I had ever endured. My own son had just assigned the value of my entire life to a single dollar bill. The crowd burst into laughter. Their laughter lashed against my dignity like a whip. A young man at the table in front raised his hand. $1 for the entertaining father, he shouted with a loud laugh. Others quickly joined in. $1.50. $2. I looked down at my hands hardened from years of work, hands that had held his while he took his first steps. Now they were trembling, but I didn't lower my head. Sometimes a smile is the only dignified choice left, so I smiled. A bitter smile. I stood there in the middle of public humiliation, surrounded by the mocking laughter of wealthy strangers. I looked at Jordan. He was laughing, truly enjoying the moment. He couldn't see the fracture in my eyes. He had no idea that from this moment on the world between father and son would never be the same again. The room continued with teasing bids. $2.10. $3. The laughter grew louder and louder, like a wave trying to drown me against the polished stage floor. I closed my eyes, waiting for the execution to end, and then suddenly a voice cut through the room. Not laughter, not a joke. A low voice. Calm. Sharp. It sliced through the crowd's laughter like a blade. $1 million. The entire room fell into a deadly silence. So quiet that I could hear my own heart pounding wildly in my chest. Silence swept across the Meridian ballroom with frightening speed. The laughter from the young man at the table in front froze in his throat. Jordan stood motionless on stage, the microphone trembling slightly in his hand. He looked toward table 1 where a man had just stood up. $1 million, the man repeated. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a mountain. It was Maurice Parker, owner of Parker Capital, one of the most powerful men in Manhattan. The very man Jordan had spent an entire year trying unsuccessfully to secure a meeting with. $1 million for an evening with Eugene Price, Maurice continued. And I still believe I'm getting a bargain. The stage lights seemed to dim in the presence of him. Jordan stammered. "Mr. Parker, you must be joking. I mean, this was just a small joke about how boring my father is." Maurice Parker stepped out from the shadow of his elegant table and looked directly into my son's eyes. "I never joke about the value of a human being, especially a man like your father. You call him boring. I call it the quiet strength of real power." I stood there on the stage, feeling as if the ground beneath my feet were shifting. At table 14, people had begun looking at me differently now. No longer like an old man in a worn suit. Now they saw a man a billionaire had just valued at $1 million. Jordan tried to regain control. "Yes, of course. $1 million for the charity. That's wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Parker." He stepped forward, extending his hand, a desperate attempt to salvage his standing. But Maurice Parker ignored Jordan's outstretched hand. Instead, he walked straight toward the stage. Toward me. The crowd held its breath. He stopped in front of me and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect I hadn't received from my own son in over a decade. "Eugene Price," Maurice said. "It's been a long time. I've been looking for you for years." I looked into the eyes of this stranger. There was a strange understanding in them, a connection that seemed to reach far beyond the luxury of this room. Old memories began stirring in my mind. A name echoed from deep in the past. Mitchell Green. Maurice turned to Jordan. My son suddenly looked painfully small under the stage lights. "You think $1 was generous," Jordan, Maurice said calmly. "That was the biggest mistake of your life. You've spent your whole life building towers made of paper, while your father built foundations of steel." The entire room erupted into murmurs. People began pulling out their phones. They were witnessing a great reversal, not through violence, but through value. If you've followed the story this far, do us a small favor. Subscribe. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. Maurice placed a hand on my shoulder again. This time it was warm. Genuine. "Eugene," he said, "could you join me for breakfast tomorrow morning? On the Upper East Side. We have a lot to discuss. And I think it's time the world learned about the man who stood behind Mitchell Green all those years ago." I nodded. Just a small nod. I didn't need to say anything. My silence now carried more value than any excuse ever could. I stepped down from the stage and walked past Jordan. He stood there frozen. The microphone was still on, and the sound of his ragged breathing echoed through the room. I didn't look at him. I looked straight toward the exit. Tonight, $1 million had been offered not to buy my time but to reclaim the honor my own son believed he could sell for pennies. Our story was only just beginning, and Jordan was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. The lesson of quiet men. The next morning, Manhattan wore a strangely quiet mood. I sat in a small diner on the Upper East Side. There were no chandeliers here, no polished tuxedos, just the smell of freshly roasted coffee and the soft rustle of morning newspapers. Maurice Parker sat across from me. He had taken off his expensive jacket. All that remained was a white shirt with the top button open. He didn't look like a billionaire. He looked like a man carrying the weight of gratitude on his shoulders. Eugene Maurice began, his voice low and warm. "I spent the whole night thinking about what Jordan said, about you being boring, about you being invisible." I looked into his eyes. I saw no pity there, only understanding. "Do you remember Mitchell Green?" Maurice's question made my heart skip a beat. Memories rushed back like a storm. 31 years ago. A small room thick with cigarette smoke. Mitchell sat there, his face hollow from a string of failures. He needed $50,000 to save his startup company. The bank had slammed its doors shut. His family had turned their backs on him. I gave him the money. It was every dollar I had saved from working 3 jobs at once. I didn't ask for a contract. I didn't ask for collateral. I simply reached out my hand. "Mitchell, I believe in you. Do what you need to do." We shook hands. A handshake between two men. Maurice smiled. "Mitchell Green was my mentor, Eugene. Before he passed away last year, he told me about you. He said you were the man with the quietest strength he had ever known, that you said more through silence than most people say in an entire lifetime." Mitchell told me that handshake saved his life not because of the money, but because of the absolute trust of a quiet man. If you followed the story this far, do us a small favor, subscribe. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. I looked down at my hands. Hands that had once given hope to a friend. Jordan had never known about Mitchell. He had never once asked about those years. All he ever saw was the old house in Queens, the beat-up car I drove to work every day. He measured a man's worth by the numbers on a balance sheet. Maurice pulled out a small folder. "Mitchell left part of his legacy for me to manage," he said. "But he had one final request. If I ever found Eugene Price, I was to offer him this opportunity." He slid the document across the table. "It's a partnership proposal, an investment in Parker Capital's Clean Energy Infrastructure Fund, 15% equity. That number was worth tens of millions of dollars. But I didn't feel excitement. What I felt instead was a deep sadness. The trust I once gave a friend 3 decades ago had now returned to restore my honor, while the son I raised had tried to destroy it." I looked at Maurice. "I have one condition." Maurice raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead. Don't meet with Jordan right now. Don't sign any contracts with him. Let him wait. Let him feel the silence he once mocked in me. I want him to understand that the ground he stands on isn't as solid as he thinks." I paused. "My patience has been aging for 6 decades. Now it's time for it to do its work." Maurice nodded slowly. "I understand. When a quiet man decides to act, he becomes the most dangerous kind of man." We left the diner. Maurice offered to drive me home in his private car. I declined. I wanted to take the subway. I wanted to go back to Queens, back to my kitchen table. I wanted to sit there and prepare for the next steps. Jordan was probably calling Maurice non-stop. I knew that much. He was dreaming of million-dollar deals. What he didn't know was this. The very boring man he mocked the night before was the only door that could ever lead him to real success. And that door was now firmly closed by the very hands of the father he had valued at $1. 3 weeks passed. Manhattan was still rushing forward out there. but inside my small house in Queens time seemed to thicken and slow. I sat at the familiar kitchen table. On it was a cup of tea that had long gone cold and my old phone ringing again and again. It was Jordan. Again. This time I answered. The voice on the other end was almost unrecognizable. Gone was the confidence from Park Avenue. Gone was the arrogance of the young CEO. What remained was pure panic. "Dad, Maurice Parker isn't returning my calls," Jordan said, nearly out of breath. "All my deals with the other partners are being put on hold. They've heard rumors that Parker Capital might be moving into the project. But Maurice hasn't signed anything. He's just silent." "Do you know anything about this?" I looked out the window. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the rooftops. I took a slow breath. Maurice's silence was a weapon, and Jordan was standing directly in its path. "You should be more patient, Jordan," I replied in the calmest voice I could manage. "Patient," Jordan shouted. "Do you know how much money I'm losing every day? This is the opportunity of a lifetime. If this deal collapses, I lose everything. I need you to say a word to him." "What did you do that night? Why would he pay $1 million for you?" I hung up. No explanation. I wasn't angry. I was simply carrying out a kind of justice I had learned from life itself. The justice of waiting. That night I took the old leather briefcase out of the closet. I used a soft cloth to wipe the thin layer of dust from the worn leather surface. I had carried that briefcase for 22 years. Inside it were the first sketches of Mitchell Green's early ideas. Inside it were the quiet sacrifices Jordan had never cared enough to ask about. To him, the briefcase was outdated. To me, it was a witness to honor. My patience was not passivity. It was the patience of a man who had remained silent for 6 decades, patient like an underground current powerful enough to slowly carve through solid stone. Maurice Parker kept his promise. He let Jordan spin in uncertainty. With each passing day, Jordan's position grew weaker. Investors began pulling back. His arrogance slowly gave way to desperation. He was beginning to understand that the real world doesn't run on applause and staged admiration. It runs on trust, the very thing he had tried to auction off for $1. I poured myself another cup of coffee. Power is a strange feeling. Not the kind that comes from money, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly what is about to happen. Jordan thought he was standing at the peak of his career. What he didn't realize was that the ground beneath him had already been hollowed out. I looked at myself in the mirror. Eugene Price. A boring father. An invisible man. I smiled at my reflection. Tomorrow was the day Maurice had scheduled a meeting with Jordan at his office on the 43rd floor, and he wanted me there. Jordan would walk into that room with his final hope. He would prepare a perfect presentation. He would wear his most expensive suit. He would come armed with his smoothest words. But there was one thing he didn't know. The man with the real authority in that room wouldn't be the billionaire Maurice Parker. It would be the boring father he once tried to sell. I set my coffee cup down. It was time to prepare the navy suit. Time to bring the old leather briefcase. The game of hide and seek was over, and the real lesson was about to begin. If you've followed the story this far, do us a small favor: subscribe. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. It helps us keep telling stories about quiet men like this. The silence was about to end with an explosion. An explosion of truth on the 43rd floor of 6th Avenue. And I would be the one lighting the fuse. The building on 6th Avenue rose like a fortress of glass. I stood in the elevator looking at my reflection in the polished metal walls. The navy suit. The worn leather briefcase. I looked like a system error in this modern space. 43rd floor. The elevator bell rang with a dry chime. Jordan was already there, standing in the waiting area. His face looked hollow after too many sleepless nights. When he saw me step out, his eyes widened in disbelief. "Dad, what are you doing here? This is Parker Capital's office. You can't just walk in here." I didn't stop. I walked straight toward the double glass doors. Jordan hurried after me, his voice hissing through clenched teeth. "Dad, don't embarrass me any further. This is my future. I'm begging you. Just go back to Queens." I pushed the doors open. The conference room was vast, flooded with light. Maurice Parker sat at the head of the table. Beside him was an older man with silver-white hair and sharp eyes. Mitchell Green. The man Jordan had always admired as a legend in the infrastructure industry. Jordan froze. He looked at Mitchell, then at Maurice. Slowly he forced the most professional smile he could manage. "Mr. Parker, Mr. Green, this is an unbelievable honor. I didn't know Mr. Green would be here as well. And I apologize. My father must have gotten lost." Maurice Parker didn't smile. He stood up. "He's not lost, Jordan. I invited him." Mitchell Green rose from his chair and walked toward me. His eyes shimmered with emotion. He placed both hands on my shoulders. "Eugene, it's good to see you again. I never forgot that handshake 31 years ago." Jordan stood frozen in place. The folders in his hands slipped and hit the floor with a sharp clap. He looked at me, then back at Mitchell. "Dad, you know Mitchell." Green Mitchell turned toward Jordan, his expression suddenly cold. "Eugene Price doesn't just know me. He's the reason I'm still standing here today. When I had nothing, your father gave me everything he had without asking for a single piece of paper in return." Maurice Parker cleared his throat. The room fell into a suffocating silence. "Jordan," he said calmly, "I've reviewed your project carefully. Technically speaking, it's flawless." Hope flickered in Jordan's eyes. But Maurice continued, "But I don't invest in projects. I invest in people. And that night on Park Avenue, I saw exactly who you are." Maurice picked up Jordan's proposal folder. Then right in front of him, he dropped it into the trash. "I don't do business with people who cannot recognize the value of what is standing right in front of them," he said calmly. "And I never make exceptions." Jordan stammered, his voice cracking. "Mr. Parker, it was just a joke. I was only trying to raise money. I love my father." "Love?" Mitchell Green cut in, his voice trembling with anger. "You auctioned this man for $1. You turned his sacrifices into a punchline to entertain a room full of wealthy strangers. If you can treat your own father like that, how do you think you'll treat your partners when things get difficult?" Jordan turned to me, desperation in his eyes. "Dad, please say something. Tell them I didn't mean it. You know me. I need this deal." I looked at my son, the boy I once carried in my arms, the boy I believed would one day make me proud. What I felt now was an unexpected emptiness. "Do you remember this briefcase, Jordan?" I said, lifting the old leather case. "You always called it boring junk, but inside it is the truth about how you were raised. You wanted value. This is value." I turned toward Maurice and Mitchell. "I signed the agreement for the 15% stake Maurice offered me this morning. But I've made another decision. I'm transferring Fsnonomena Noro Nora Nora Nos Nora Black Nada Nos Noros Norek Nos Nada Wenches Queen's kids who understand the value of hard work and family." Jordan collapsed into the luxurious leather chair. The ground beneath him had completely fallen away. In that moment he realized the biggest deal of his life was gone. Not because he lacked capital, but because he lacked character. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it would really help if you hit like and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this channel alive. I buttoned my suit jacket and picked up the old leather briefcase. "Maurice, Mitchell, thank you for the coffee." Then I walked out of the conference room. Jordan called my name behind me, his voice breaking, but I didn't stop. Quiet men see everything. Quiet men remember everything. And when they decide to walk out of a room they have just completely rearranged, they never look back. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. 43 floors. A long ride down. But now I was finally going home. Back to where I truly belonged. I stepped out of the skyscraper. The bright Manhattan sun made me squint. Car horns and the restless rhythm of the city filled the air. I tightened my grip on the handle of the old leather briefcase. The worn leather felt steady and familiar beneath my palm. I walked toward the subway station, blending into the stream of hurried people. No one looked at me. No one knew that the man in the outdated suit had just changed the fate of $1 million. I liked that. Sometimes being invisible is a privilege. The train carried me away from the glitter of Manhattan and back to Queens, back to the red brick houses and the familiar rows of trees. I stepped inside my home. The quiet welcomed me like an old friend. I loosened my tie. I made myself a cup of coffee. Then I sat down in the wooden chair in my small kitchen. Through the window I looked out at the backyard where Jordan used to run and play as a child. A gentle sadness settled in my chest. I wasn't happy about my son's failure, but I felt relief that the truth had finally been revealed. Jordan would have to learn to stand on his own 2 feet. He would have to understand that the world doesn't owe him anything. And I would still be here, right here in this kitchen in Queens, when he was truly ready to become a man who understood real value. Eugene Price was never boring. I was never boring. I simply chose silence. And there is a very big difference between silence and absence. Quiet men see everything. They remember everything. And when they act, the world has no choice but to listen. My advice to you is simple. Never underestimate people who don't need to raise their voices to prove who they are. Never mistake humility for weakness. And above all, cherish those who quietly sacrifice to build the foundation of your life. Because once they decide to walk away without looking back, you'll realize that what you just lost is something money can never buy again. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting like and subscribing to hear more real, raw, family-centered stories. Thank you for being part of this space. I took a sip of my hot coffee. For the first time in a long while, I felt completely like myself again. No apologies. No need to prove anything. Just Eugene Price. A man who had finally come home.